In 2008, you may have heard the term, who's going to answer the phone at 3 a.m. for the call? Well, that actually happened. Remember the 1983 movie WarGames? The film is about a computer game with the potential to start thermonuclear war. It was starring Matthew Broderick. But strangely, this scenario is more truth than fiction, because in 1979, November of 1979, programmers at NORAD almost started World War III when they accidentally ran a computer simulation of a Soviet attack. Welcome to the History Buff, short snippets of history which are odd or lesser known, and I try to keep videos at 5 to 7 minutes long, just enough to keep your interest and that you can move forward with the rest of your day. If you do like the content, consider subscribing. And if you really do like the content, please consider getting on board with our Patreon account. Every dollar helps out with the channel. So thank you so much. Here's the rest of the video. In the early morning hours of November 9th, 1979, Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor for President Carter, was awakened by a horrifying phone call. According to NORAD, the Soviet Union had just launched 250 missiles headed straight for American soil. Brzezinski received another call not long after that, and NORAD was reporting that it was now 2,200 missiles. This was the moment that every American living through the Cold War had feared, and U.S. officials had no plans to notify the public. Brzezinski didn't even bother waking up his wife. He assumed that he and everyone he knew would soon be dead, so there was really no sense in troubling her. One can only imagine the dismal post-apocalyptic world flashing before his mind's eye as he thought about his next steps. I knew that if it were true, then within about a half an hour, I and my loved ones and Washington and the majority of America would cease to exist. I wanted to be sure that we'd have company, Brzezinski told a biographer in 2011. What Brzezinski meant was that he wanted to make sure if the attack was real, that the Soviet Union would be little more than a giant hole in the ground. If we were going down, our socialist adversaries were going to be going down with us. But Brzezinski wanted confirmation before calling the president and launching missiles at the Soviets. There had been other false alarms in the past, but this one looked more legit. Thankfully, before he could notify President Carter, he received a third call that no other warning systems had picked up signs of an attack. NORAD would continue to keep a close eye on the skies, but this appeared to be yet another false alarm. So how did it happen? A computer program that simulated nuclear attack by the Soviet Union had been fed through NORAD's network. Terrifyingly, NORAD and everyone else in the network mistook their own drilled program as a real attack. Even though the president wasn't notified in real time and only became aware of the incident later, events were set in motion to provide a second strike. 10 American and Canadian jets were scrambled in preparation for war that had the potential to dramatically change life on our planet for many, many generations to come, but the president wasn't kept in the loop. The United States had a system in place dating back to the 1960s for these kinds of scenarios. The president is supposed to be aboard a plane so that he can be able to make decisions from the air during a nuclear conflict. Curiously, that flight, a mobile command center called the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, reportedly took off without the president on board. When the 1979 NORAD computer incident was first reported to the American press, the whole thing was downplayed as something that didn't pose any real threat to American security. News reports of the time made it very clear that the president wasn't notified, something that was supposed to soothe the American public, But they failed to mention that Carter's national security advisor had been informed and was sitting at home contemplating a retaliatory strike, not to mention the death of everyone he loved. Michael Warner had explained that this incident would involve a bizarre cycle of art imitating life, imitating art. In a case of art imitating life, the popular thriller WarGames adopted this scenario in 1983, and President Ronald Reagan was impressed enough by the co-star Matthew Broderick's hacking skills to mention the movie's scenario at a meeting with members of Congress and the Army's Chief of Staff. Lastly, in a case of life imitating art, high school students from Milwaukee, inspired by WarGames and calling themselves the 414s after the city's telephone area code, proved that same summer that high schoolers really could get inside unclassified military networks. So how did they try to remedy these particular problems in 1979? For one, NORAD built a $16 million test facility off-site so that they weren't feeding simulation programs directly into the detection network. A 1981 report by the General Accounting Office cited this as absolutely necessary to make sure that the computer program couldn't set off false alarms again. But both the US and the Soviet Union would see many more false alarms in the coming years. In fact, we know at least 3 examples in 1980 alone. Another false alarm would occur in 1983 when a Soviet lieutenant in Moscow by the name of Stanislav Petrov received a warning that American ICBMs were headed towards Russia. His decision not to launch a counterstrike based on the funny feeling in his gut saved humanity from an absolute nuclear destruction. November 9th, 2019 will be the 40th anniversary, so take comfort in knowing that the people that you love and who are around you are still here because one person had the ability to hold off just a little bit longer. Now you know your history.